everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, and today I'm joined by Mallory Grimste. Mallory is a mental health therapist, and her superhero cape is tailored to helping teenagers dealing with some of the toughest challenges, such as self-harm, feeling lost, battling anxious thoughts, and navigating the shadowy valleys of depression. Today, we're going to talk about helping teens and young adults who are dealing with self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and anxiety by using practical, evidence-based coping skills. Welcome, Mallory. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so you want to kind of do an overview of the population that you're talking about for the therapists who are listening?
Sure. So I primarily work with people in their teenage to young adult years. So middle school, high school, college age, those transitionary years where you're really trying to figure out who you are, what's your place in the world, and like who you're going to be as an adult in this world. So that's primarily who I work best with. And I have a true desire and heart for working with people who struggle with suicidal thinking and self-harm in particular, because when I was first coming up training to be a therapist, I worked in crisis work. I worked in, it was called emergency mobile psychiatric services, where we would literally go out to families' homes, the schools to do these crisis evaluations, to take the burden off the emergency department. And that was definitely helpful in and of itself. But the sticking point was then trying to find the ongoing providers for these kids, because people were either afraid to work with teenagers or afraid to work with teenagers with these particular set of issues. And so I became frustrated with that. That's a big reason why I went into private practice. And I mean, they're not so scary if you know what you're doing.
Right. Yeah. And you are right. I applaud you for working with this population. A lot of people shy away from teens because of the parents, which can be difficult to work with.
But tips for that.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah. And they also shy away from these really high risk cases, but we need people doing that. So I applaud you for doing that.
Oh, thank you. Well, they're really doing the work. I just provide the support and the room for them to do that work.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and I think sometimes clients come into therapy not really understanding that.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm here with you, but you got to do the work, my friend.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about, can you talk a little bit about your assessment procedure for these clients?
Oh, sure. They're pretty, standard. I do a usual client assessment where you go through the biopsychosocial, that whole thing. But then if anything around self-harm, suicidal ideation, any of the safety risk stuff, I have the added benefit and training of having worked in emergency site, both in that program and through Yale and Navy hospital system. So I feel very fortunate that I've had a variety of exposures to different strategies and assessments. But I always go back to, it's called Robert's 7-stage model. That was the first one I was trained in. It's the one that I think is most comprehensive, and it's where you go through 7 different areas that you're assessing. So one is the risk level. One is the lethality of that statement, history, and on and on. There's a lot of other different assessment models that you can use, but for me, that's the one that I always go back to.
Okay, that's great to know, because I think I've been seeing a lot of trainings being offered recently around needing to get better around suicidality and self-harm, and it's just not something we're always doing really great in our field. So that's a helpful resource to have.
Yeah, I remember when I was being trained as a social worker in grad school, I had a professor who I feel very fortunate. She told us that you're not going to get this training unless you seek it out. And so she specifically put together a course that was over the winter intersession, which that was tough.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, it was all about assessing for crisis intervention. That's really how I got into the crisis work, really, was through that class and through her teaching. And had I not known that was not something I was going to get unless I thought it, which is wild to me, considering the population that we all work with.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We'll just leave that there. We both agree on that. Okay, so you've used this tool, you've identified the different aspects that they're presenting with. Where do you go from there?
It really depends, because it really is situational to the person, to the family, to, what their risk level is. But typically we're always trying to figure out, okay, what is the plan that they have and how likely is that plan to follow through? And can we put any safety measures or stabilization measures in place, whether directly with the teen or their family? I actually really like working with teenagers with this population in particular because of the parent aspect. I know a lot of people shy away from that, but you've got built-in people who typically love and care about this kid already. They're contributing to allowing them to be in therapy, that if you give them the resources and you tell them what to do, what to say, when to call, who to call, all of those things, it's going to make a huge impact.
Right. Yeah. And I think setting those boundaries, setting that all up ahead of time is really helpful. I think the complications come when you have a marriage that's not healthy, or there's already a separation or divorce involved. And then I found that the parents would try and pull me in between, and, well, you talk to the mom, you got to talk to me. And, that push and pull can be difficult, but obviously setting that all up ahead of time has to help.
Yeah. And I'm a human being. I definitely am going to take that to heart sometimes myself as well. So I want to acknowledge and validate that. And that's where I think having a really great consultation group to set that out with, it's really helpful. But at the same time, I always come back to, I had a really great supervisor early who was telling me, what is your role in this dynamic? Like my role, I'm an individual therapist for the teenager. I'm not the family therapist. I'm not the couple therapist. I'm not the crisis interventionist, even though I have training and skills in all those areas, but that's not my particular role in this situation, this scenario. That I find really useful and helpful. And then also being compassionate that if this is my experience as a therapist, like this is good clinical information for what's happening at home outside of the therapy office, which can be really useful and helpful in that ongoing therapy work. Because, with teenagers, yes, it would be lovely to have like the cushiest, coziest family environment that they get it right all the time, but that's not realistic. At the end of the day, we're always going to be coming up against invalidating environments, even if we have the right strategies and the right skills and the right tool sets. So being able to learn how to survive in those environments, it's really useful and helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because, sometimes the conversation I have had with the teens in the past is the only thing that makes a parent is giving birth to a child. And that doesn't mean they all of a sudden have a skill set or an ability to give you everything that you need. And just kind of normalizing that for kids who don't really have the best environment, and then putting those supports in place. So let's talk about the tips and strategies that you use to better support these clients.
Sure. In what capacity? In like the coping skills area, or working with parents in this area?
Well, let's follow up with the parents, since we were already talking about that, and then we'll shift into the clients themselves.
Sure. So I think you said it really well already, that being really clear and intentional with your own boundaries within the working environment. And it's okay to keep being a broken record and allowing that. Sometimes parents are going to be emotional when they really care about, sometimes this is literally life and death with their kid. I mean, that's scary. You're going to have all sorts of emotional limbic responses, right? Yeah. So taking some time to pause. Just because somebody is blowing up your text messages or your voicemail or your email, does that mean you have to respond? You can put that on mute. You can respond when you have the time and energy to clearly, safely respond, just like you would with a therapy client. And making sure that everybody's really crystal clear on the crisis numbers in your area. It's something I have all over my website. I have it at the bottom of all my reminders, all my emails, everything. Like I would just highlight that everywhere. Even
Yeah.
if you're not actively working with people who are actively suicidal or self-harming, you just never know when that disclosure could be coming or that some life event could happen. And if people don't know, if they're already in a crisis state, they're not thinking, so where's that crisis number that Mallory gave me?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. All right. So what about working with the teens and young adults?
Oh, I've done for them.
Great. We want to hear all about it.
Yeah. So I always try to start with what's already working for them. And it's really, I come from more of a harm reduction versus a total abstinence model. That could potentially be somebody's goal and it could be achievable. But I think it's also a hard jump to go from if you have really been relying on self-injury for coping, even if it's not the healthiest, it still is a coping strategy. It's helping you move through a difficult experience, not in the healthiest way, of course. So we want to start with what else is helping you working, and then helping to educate them on all the different coping skills that are available to them that they might not even realize are coping skills. So in dialectical behavior therapy or DBT, I'm heavily informed by that.
Yeah, I would imagine. I would imagine that's really useful with this population.
Yeah, and I really like the way that they break down the skill sets into 4 different types so that then you can figure out, okay, if I am really struggling with overthinking about something and spiraling, I just can't stop thinking or obsessing, ruminating about something, I'm going to go to distraction strategies because in that skill set, it's going to help me take a break from those stressful thoughts and focus on something else for a little bit. And now the thing to remember is just because you use a coping strategy does not mean that it solves the problem. Those are totally different skill sets, but you've got to be able to handle and cope with your emotions before you can get into problem solving because it's probably going to spike along the way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you are heavy with the DBT skills. You also have more self-care strategies. Is that another tool that you use?
Yeah. So once we've got coping skills down in tandem, we really try to highlight the self-care strategies because oftentimes people think emotion regulation is the coping skills. And yes, that can help with regulating your emotions, but true emotion regulation is going to help and come from maintaining your basic self-care. So making sure that you're eating throughout the day, making sure you're staying hydrated, like all the boring stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I've tried to create a few different resources that make it a little more interesting and fun, particularly for the teenage population. But I found that I have a YouTube channel where I've shared a lot of these resources. I've created like self-care bingo for teens to make it a little more fun. But I find over and over again, I get people who are much older than the teenage years writing and saying how useful and helpful it is. And to be honest, I use a lot of these for myself as well.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. They're so much different these days in the things that they're navigating, the stressors that they have in their world. And I know sometimes parents forget that. They think about their own childhood. They don't think about that at 9 o'clock, no one was allowed to call your house. So you couldn't be like bullied at home. You know, there were less ways to really reach out to someone and create harm to them. And so I think it's a good reminder for parents that these teens and young adults are living in a very different world, because I've had the experience of parents sort of like poo-poo the self-care thing. And they're like, really? Like, what is so hard in their life? And I'm like, well, have you spent a day in their life? Because they're really struggling with a whole lot today. And, you know, parents would say to me, like, I'm really worried they're just in their room all by themselves. And I'd say, do they have a device? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, they are in there with the entire world. They have access to the entire world. So that's more concerning to me that they're doing this. You know, you're not sure what they're doing, or you know, but you're not really monitoring it. So those things are important to remind parents, I would imagine.
Yeah. And there's so much more access. It goes both ways. Teens can access so much more information and support through these digital advice or devices. but other people are also coming in through their devices too, which is where you have to be really intentional and careful about where you're getting your information from, how accurate it is. One of the things I really loved that YouTube did a few years ago, and I think it was mostly related to some of the COVID conspiracy videos that were coming out. I wish it was because of mental health, but it serves us too, is that if you are a licensed health professional, you can apply for something that's called the healthcare shelf, and YouTube will put on all your videos that this is from a licensed healthcare professional. So it's coming from a valid source and not just somebody with a camera.
Wow, that's good to know. How do you do that? Is it under settings somewhere?
I think that's so long ago. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah.
But I'm certain because Google and YouTube are tied together, if you literally Google how to apply for healthcare shelf, it'll pop right up.
Okay. That's very useful information to know, and not something I'm sure a lot of therapists know about, because I know a number on YouTube and I've never heard that before. So thank you. That's a great tip right there.
Yeah, it really, really helped. And before they did that, because most of my information was geared towards suicidal thinking, self-harm, all the flag words, right?
Right.
I wasn't really getting a lot of reach on a lot of the videos, which is okay. I think it was reaching enough people that it was making an impact. That wasn't really my goal to be this big YouTube superstar. But I noticed a significant difference once they validated that I was legitimate.
Right. Yeah. They would do that on TikTok. Well, actually, all the socials, it'd be really nice if they did that, because so much information is being absorbed and not everyone is really discerning about checking into who the source is. And do they know what they're talking about? Is this valid? I hear, clients talk about, well, I follow this person on YouTube and on Instagram, and I'll start asking questions, and they're like, I don't know who they are or what their experience is, and so I'm like, that might be something you want to look into.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I know, to circle back to your earlier question about, the parents being concerned about teens on their devices and everything. One of the ways that I found is most impactful to work with the teens that I work with is, rather than being the voice piece between teen and parent, or parent and parent, or whoever, I'm really conscientious about trying to help the teenager communicate to their parents and the parents to communicate to the teenager directly. So if a parent is wanting to talk about their child's care in between sessions, they certainly can do that. I offer that as, no extra charge for the parents that I work with, because to me, I just roll it into the work that I'm doing, working with teenagers. That's important if they have questions. But I feel like a broken record sometimes, because I'm like, that's a great question. We should ask today.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I would imagine that some of the work you do with the teens is saying that sounds like something you need to talk to your parents about. Let's talk about what that conversation is going to sound like. Or you've just learned some really great tools today, and sometimes it's hard to remember those when you're struggling. And if your parents know what they are, they can help out there too with reminding you about those skills.
Yeah. I also like to plug in that, you can teach your parents what you're learning about, and you may find that your parents are using strategies too.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Something I do with all of my clients these days is, as we discuss coping skills and different types of tools, I have them create a note in their phone called I'm struggling, or whatever phrase they're comfortable with. And then I have them add to that list, okay, this is a new strategy. Because, we know that when you're in crisis, you're not thinking clearly. But if they can just remember, okay, I have a list somewhere. Let me look at the list and grab something from there, and that can help. So it sounds like, you're doing similar stuff there with just really driving that home.
Yeah, I have a tool that I created called the Coping Ahead Plan, where it literally walks through, okay, these are potential stressors or known stressors that I know could set off something that's problematic for me. If you've got exams coming up, I think everybody could agree, exams, even if you're an A-star student, they're stressful. So coming up with coping strategies or coping skills that can apply to that situation, and then identifying safe, responsible adults that you can reach out to support. And I'm very clear that it should be a safe, responsible adult, not another teenager, because we never know what our friends are going through. And we don't always know as a teenager all the resources and strategies that could be available to us. It's not that they can't be helpful, but if you're in a crisis state, you're going to want to go to, again, a safe, responsible adult, not just anybody.
Yeah, that's such an important point because we know we don't know what that other person's, that teen, that friend, we don't know what their motivations are. And unfortunately, we've seen cases where people were reaching out to friends and who were leading them down a path to more self-harm or considering suicide, which is very frightening. So yeah, I think that's such an important point.
Yeah. And I always recommend that when they put somebody down on their plan, before they do, to tell them that they consider themselves a resource and would they be okay calling in situations like this? Or do they have the do they have the ability and the availability to give you if you call? Or do they have certain parameters? Like I tell all the teams that I work with that you can call me, you can text me at any time. I may not answer at any time. I do sleep. I do go out with friends. I may be in a session with somebody. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring it. That's why you have all these other people and all these other resources available. And I will return your call. I will return your message as soon as I can.
Yeah. Yeah. And that once they get to trust you, I'm sure they believe you they believe you because, there's a lot of people in their lives that will say that and not necessarily do that. So it's important that they have established that trust with you. So they're like, okay, I know Mallory really means this. So yeah.
Yeah. I have a few who never test it. And then I have a few who always test it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's the whole gamut of what to expect with teens and young adults.
Yeah. And I will say, because I know other therapists are going to be listening to this. If you are not comfortable with that and you are not okay with that, be clear with your clients about that too and let them know what the parameters are for reaching out in between sessions. And I don't think it's a wrong thing to say you can only contact me during session. But then you need to communicate that because it does impact the therapeutic relationship. I found that over and over again when I worked at the hospital setting that they thought it was a certain arrangement and the therapist thought it was something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. So are there other tools that you can share with us about either caring for ourselves as therapists working with like high-risk populations or also tips and tools to use with the more of, okay, I'm going to say that again. Okay. Oh, God, it's not just tips. No, it's not just you. So more tips and tools to use with the clients as well.
Yeah. So I have a video on my YouTube channel. I have nearly 400 on there. So if you go on and search, you could find a lot of information for free right there. But there's a video about how to handle consistent suicidal thoughts using a coping ahead plan. It literally goes through this whole process, how I work with teens in these situations. And you can learn from that and apply that for yourself. And then if you want that resource, I've got that resource and a ton of other resources available in my self-care bundle. I think there's 27 tools in there right now. And there's guided workbook, audio, without the ads. That's the most annoying thing about YouTube, right? You're really getting into it and then an ad pops up.
Right. Yeah.
And if you don't know, creators have very little control over that. It doesn't matter if I turn ads off on a video, YouTube will put an ad on there. So they're not doing that to you on purpose if you're following along with a meditation or something.
Right. Okay. So I love the concept of coping ahead. I think that's wonderful. The bundle that you mentioned, and I'm going to put all your contact stuff in the show notes, but so that's something that therapists can purchase, or is that for clients or both?
Anybody can purchase it and use it. That's not a problem. A lot of the resources that I've shared on the YouTube channel, I've put in there so that it's ad-free, that they can have that. And then they have the added bonuses in there, having it in a workbook format or in an audio, not just video, so they can kind of pick and choose what works best for them.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to ask you about navigating privacy and confidentiality, because that's particularly hard with teens. And there's actually really specific laws that differ by state and license type, which complicates the conversation. So people need to look into that themselves. But can we talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you already hit the nail on the head with that one. You need to check with your licensing board, not just like your national board, but your state. If you're in the United States, it does vary state by state. And then you also have to check with the state law, because the state board and the state law may not always match up, and it can be different for different populations. If you have a situation and you're not sure or you're unclear, call your malpractice insurance. That's what they're there for. If they don't have the answer themselves, they will tell you exactly where to go to get the answer, and document.
Right. Yeah. And I just have to say that the malpractice insurance, liability insurance, is the most underused resource. Like, I talk to therapists all the time and I'm like, well, this is a great resource. They're like, really? I can call them? I'm like, that's what you're paying for. They don't want you to get into trouble. They want you to do it right. So they're there for you.
Yeah. And they're usually, I only had to call them for 2 situations, and they're like regular people. So they're not going to be like these very like up to that lawyery type. They're going to help you out.
Mm-hmm.
So besides that, the other thing that you want to be conscientious of is being crystal clear with what your policy is and what you consider to be a break in confidentiality and why you would be doing that. So for me, I literally have a huge poster on my wall in my therapy office. I'm not in there today, or there sure too, but it says, what you say here stays in here unless, and then it's got the 3 like disclaimers in there about you want to hurt or harm yourself, you want to hurt or harm someone else, or someone else is in danger of being hurt or harmed. And so there is some wiggle room within that, of course, and you need to make sure that you are letting the person know that this is why you're concerned and why you're reaching out for whatever source or support that you're reaching for at that point. So for me, since I work with the under 18 crowd, sometimes that does mean the parents. So I make that very clear, and I do my best to always give the teenager the option of how we notify them. So if it's like an acute safety risk, we don't have time to notify the parents, or we got to like act right now, there's not as much choice in that.
Yes.
But if it's something where, okay, they tell me that this comes up sometimes, they tell me that last week they tried to kill themselves, they tried to die by suicide in a certain way. The moment has passed, technically. That's a very major concern, and parents need to know and help them navigate that. They're still developing, they're not adults, so they don't have that same full development of their brain to process some of the risk-taking behavior, which is why it's great to have parents involved.
Yes.
Now, parents don't always follow through either, but having an extra layer is helpful and useful. So you may need to inform them that, hey, you need to make sure all your medication is in a safe, secure space. There's ways that you can do that. You can go out and purchase a medication lockbox. You can carry them around in your purse if that makes you feel more comfortable. Like, there's lots of ways that you can do it, but you want to make sure that like you're letting them know what the risks are and everything with that. And then the other thing that I think a lot of therapists, especially if you're not used to being in an area that is pro-gun or like gun, that's the word I'm looking for. I guess like it's like normal to have guns around. It's really, really important to ask, are there guns in the home? And it's not to say that there can't be, but if there are guns in the home, you want to be aware of that. You want to just kind of bring to the parents that, hey, it's a really good idea to have those locked up. One person has the key.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So something that comes up periodically that feels like a gray area, I'd love to hear your perspective, is if you know of someone else that is a at risk of harm. So if one of your clients says, oh yeah, my friend's been talking about wanting to die by suicide. Of course, they're not going to use that term, but we try to use that term.
They might.
They might? Okay.
Like, yeah, they're way more savvy than us sometimes. I'm like,
oh, that's a great point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So how do you navigate that? Because it's really secondhand information, right?
So they treat it as though it is the person in front of you that's saying this. I can't tell you how many times teens think that they're being cute about it or like slick about it, and they're really talking about themselves. So I wouldn't ignore it and like just table and be like, oh, they have to figure that out, you know? So I will go through it with the teenager about how they can support their friends in a safe, responsible way. And I have a ton of videos on this too, if people are interested in that. But one of the first things is walk through literally the Cope and Head plan. Okay, what are things that help you in this situation that you could help share with your friend that they might not know about coping skills? Great. Who else can they talk to about this? Who are the safe, responsible adults? And letting them know, this is always the thing that blows their mind every time, that if their friend is going through something and they're concerned about that for their friend and they're afraid to go to a safe, responsible adult, like a guidance counselor or parent, offering to go with them, that makes such a huge difference. It's amazing how many kids get support this way. It's scary to ask for help, especially by yourself. You've got your buddy with you. It makes it way easier.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great point. And I will also say for the therapists out there who are parents of teens themselves, those were some rough years for me because my kids would bring a friend over saying like, hey, can you talk to them? Or I just heard that so-and-so wants to kill themselves. I had to sit my kids down and say, let's talk about how this works. Okay. Like, no, I can't talk to your friend at the house. I can't actually work with them at all because they're your friends. So I can refer them to someone else. You know, it just sort of helping them understand that because especially with one of my children, it was like weekly. And I would engage with the guidance counselor. And I don't know if it was that particular class or what, but I feel like I burned out that counselor because again, it's like, this is kind of a school issue. The parents need to be involved. Like let's reach out to your guidance counselor. But yeah, so just be aware of that if you have your own teenagers.
Yeah. And I will say you probably didn't burn out that counselor. I mean, that is their role and responsibility to help be kind of that guide and connector for these kids. And what a great resource that they had in you, that you were able to help identify and connect these kids to them, to then connect them to help, because who knows what direction that could have gone in.
Yeah. Well, the guidance counselor did leave for an elementary school.
Like, it's not for everyone.
Maybe she didn't quite realize how, difficult some of this can be as a guidance counselor.
Yeah, and I do think it does make a difference if your administrators at school are understanding and supportive. I mean, it's hard work.
It is. Absolutely. It's hard work. Yeah. And depending on the school, there could be multiple guidance counselors, or there could be just one if it's a small school. And hopefully the administrators are encouraging them to reach out to colleagues to get that regular support that we know is so necessary in this work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so is there anything else you wanted to be sure to share with us today?
The only other thing that I wanted to share that I failed to share earlier was I also have a program that's geared towards working with teenagers directly that are dealing with this, called the Coping Skills Crash Course. It runs through all these strategies, how to personalize and create your coping ahead plan, how to apply it. And we do offer monthly coaching calls with that. We're on summer break right now. We're kind of regrouping and reformatting some of the programming, but we'll be back with that in the fall, the coaching calls. That's a really, really great resource where if you have clients that are struggling with this, that are having trouble remembering what to do in between sessions, if you don't want them calling you or texting you all the time, like, well, that's the thing that you told me to do. It's all right there.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's wonderful. Okay. So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you if you have a favorite phrase or analogy that you like to use with your clients.
Yes, I have two, if that's okay.
Okay, perfect. Yes.
So one is, and they all know this, I repeat this over and over again, to remember that it can take 6 to 8, so 6, 7, or 8 coping strategies to match the relief that you want from a problem behavior. So it's not like a one and done thing.
Right.
Like having not just one or two on your list, like really shooting for that 6, 7, or 8 on your list is really going to help and being able to run through them.
Yeah.
The other thing, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's really important. And that's with clients of any age, making sure that you're really specific about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because they'll come in and they're like, well, I tried to drink a glass of cold water and I was so angry. I'm like, well, of course. Like, that's a great first step. Let's keep going.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And then the other thing, I always end all my sessions with the same question. They all know, and some of them love it. Some of them are like, this again. But it's so helpful. And I ask them every single time, what did you find most meaningful or valuable from today's session? This really helps to solidify what they found useful and important and what they're taking out of this session, not only for themselves, but for me too, as a therapist, to know like, okay, that's the part that landed or that's the part that resonated, so I can take that in for future information.
Sure. Yeah, that's so helpful because not only are you finding out what landed, then you're able to recognize the other things that didn't land. So maybe you need to bring those up again and revisit that in another session.
Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Yolam co-wrote a book with his clients, and he had done this thing where he would have them, rate what they thought was the top takeaway of the session and keyword. And he found over and over again that they rarely matched. So that's what really inspired that question, where it's like, what I think I'm doing to help might not be what's actually helping.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And there are some EHRs that are actually more like EMRs, which are a different level than what we typically use in therapy. But I know some therapists that work in a setting where they have that. And they passed a law a number of years ago that clients have a right to look at all their medical records. So they can have those notes in there. And so being mindful of reinforcing through that the things that you talked about. So, maybe you can sort of remind them a little bit about something that didn't really drive home, but they can always go back and look at that.
Yeah. And I just listened to your repeat episode with Melissa McCafferty Hall on this.
Oh, yeah.
I just listened to your episode, or the former pilot. And it was so eye-opening I knew about working with the military because I've had a few kids that have gone on to enlist. So being very intentional and careful about how do you want to navigate the fact that you've been in therapy that's not going to hurt your career.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. But with teenagers in particular, it's so important to be really responsible with the notes that you're taking, because technically parents could get access to that as well up to a certain age, and you just never know who else is going to get that information and where their life may be going. So you want to just make sure, you're being conscientious in your documentation, of course, but not pushing this kid into a direction that they can't come back from.
Yeah. Yes. And hopefully we're doing that, our due diligence anyway with that. But I think the recognition that there are certain populations that are a lot more vulnerable. And, what we talked about in that episode was, there are generalists out there who work for agencies who don't get to choose which clients they work with. So either asking a supervisor, I don't have this skill set, can you provide resources, or can we transfer this client to someone else, or seeking out that information yourself. But I'm fully aware of this because of where I live, but I think a lot of therapists don't really even know about those types of careers.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it could be careers that you might not associate with that. You just don't know where somebody's life is going to take them, especially when they're 15.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, I so appreciate you joining me today, Mallory. This has been a great conversation. I will share the contact information you gave me in the show notes so people can find how to connect with you, to work with you in other ways, and get some of the resources that you have available. For all of you hardworking therapists out there, please remember our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely.